The summer had gone rotten. That was how Mercy Calloway described it to herself as she carried her basket through the market square, past the stocks where Thomas Arden sat with his wrists locked in wood, flies gathering at the corners of his eyes. He had been accused on a Tuesday. He had confessed by Thursday. The confession had been beaten into him like a nail into soft pine, and now here he sat, a man who had farmed the same 6 acres for 30 years, staring at the dirt between his feet as if searching for something he had lost long ago and could no longer name. Mercy was 17. She was the daughter of a tailor, unremarkable in most ways that Salem valued. She was not wealthy, not connected to the magistrates, not beautiful enough to inspire envy, or plain enough to escape notice entirely. She existed in that dangerous middle space that small towns reserve for people they have not yet decided what to do with. She kept her head down. She bought her flour. She tried very hard not to look at Thomas Arden. She looked anyway. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and what she saw in them was not guilt or madness or the dull surrender of a man who had accepted his punishment. What she saw was something far worse. It was clarity. Thomas Arden was the most awake person in Salem, because terror had burned away everything else, and what remained behind his eyes was a single, perfectly articulate thought. None of this is real, and all of it is happening. Mercy looked away and walked faster. The accusations had begun in February, first with the girls, the trembling, the fits, the pointing fingers, and by August the jail was full and the gallows had been busy, and the town had divided itself into 2 kinds of people: those who were afraid of witches and those who were afraid of being called one. The real fear, the bone-deep existential kind, was reserved for the second category. Mercy belonged to it. Most people did, whether they admitted it or not. She had watched 6 people hang. She had not wanted to watch, but in Salem, the hangings were public, and absence from a public hanging invited exactly the kind of scrutiny no one could afford. So she had stood in the crowd with her neighbors and watched men and women she had known all her life drop through the air and become something other than people, and she had kept her face arranged in the expression the town required: grave, certain, relieved. She had not felt any of those things. What she had felt, standing beneath the gallows on a blue August morning, was a cold and specific wrongness, the way you feel when you watch someone make a mistake that cannot be undone, and everyone around you is nodding as though it is correct. The Calloway house sat at the eastern edge of town, close enough to the tree line that Mercy could hear the forest at night. The owls, the wind moving through the old growth, the occasional sound she could not identify and had taught herself not to try. Her father believed the trees were full of the devil's servants. Her mother, who had died of fever when Mercy was 9, had believed the trees were simply trees. Mercy had always quietly agreed with her mother. It was on a Wednesday evening in late August, with the sky the color of an old bruise and the heat still pressing down like something with weight and intention, that she first saw the smoke. It rose from deep in the trees, thin and gray, the kind of smoke that a fire makes when it has been burning for a long time and has settled into itself. Not a campfire. Campfires made cheerful, billowing smoke. This was deliberate smoke, patient smoke, the kind that suggested whoever was tending it was in no hurry at all. She told herself it was a woodsman. She told herself this several times over the next 3 evenings, because the smoke returned each night at the same hour, and each night she stood at her bedroom window and watched it rise and told herself the same rational, reasonable lie. On the fourth night, she went into the trees. She could not explain afterward why she did it. Curiosity felt too small a word. It was more like the smoke had asked her a question, and she was constitutionally incapable of leaving it unanswered. She brought no lantern. Lanterns could be seen, and being seen moving toward the woods after dark in Salem in 1692 was a particular kind of death wish. She moved by moonlight through the first 100 yards of trees, her skirts catching on undergrowth, her heart doing something complicated in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but shared a border with both. She smelled it before she saw it. Herbs burning, something floral and green, and beneath it something older, darker, the way deep earth smells when it has been turned over. Then she came through a gap in the trees and stopped. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet across. At its center burned a fire in a shallow stone ring, the flames low and very blue at the edges, ordinary orange at the heart. Around the fire stood 7 women. Mercy knew 4 of them. Goody Marsh, the midwife, who had delivered half the children in Salem, including Mercy herself. She was 60 if she was a day, with white hair loose around her shoulders in a way that no respectable woman wore it, and her face in the firelight was nothing like the careful, quiet face she showed the town. It was fierce, it was ancient, it was satisfied in a way that made Mercy's skin tighten. Anne Price, the blacksmith's widow, who everyone said had gone strange after her husband died. Strange had always seemed like the wrong word to Mercy. Anne Price had merely seemed like a woman who had stopped pretending, and Salem had never forgiven her for it. Young Ruth Heller, barely 16, who worked in the Paris household and kept her eyes down and said nothing in any room she occupied. Her eyes were not down now. They were up, reflecting fire, and she was smiling in a way that made her look like someone who had been holding their breath for years and had finally exhaled. And Martha Corey, who had been hanged 3 weeks ago. Mercy's mind rejected this information immediately and completely. It offered several alternatives: a woman who resembled Martha Corey, a trick of firelight, a fever dream precipitated by heat and poor sleep. She stood at the tree line and tried on each of these explanations, and none of them fit, because she knew Martha Corey's hands, had watched those hands pass bread at the meeting house 100 times, and the woman standing across the fire had those exact hands, and those hands were moving in patterns that Mercy did not know the name for, but that her body recognized with a cold, primal certainty that bypassed thought entirely. Mercy stepped back. A branch broke under her foot. Goody Marsh looked up. Their eyes met across the firelit dark, and Mercy turned and ran. She ran until the tree line gave way to the field behind her father's house. And then she stopped and bent over and put her hands on her knees and breathed until breathing felt normal again, which took some time. Martha Corey had been hanged. Mercy had watched. She had stood in the crowd and watched the woman drop and go still and be cut down and carried away. And now Martha Corey was standing in a clearing in the woods with her hands moving in patterns that had no name. Mercy straightened up. She looked at the house. The candle in her father's window, he always left one burning, was steady and ordinary and real. She went inside and lay down on her bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep until well past the time the birds started. The first death was Magistrate Holt. He was found on a Friday morning in his study, sitting upright in his chair behind his desk, his hands folded on the Bible open in front of him, his face arranged in an expression of complete terror. Not dead in any visible sense, no wound, no mark, no sign of illness. The physician could find nothing wrong. His heart beat, his lungs moved, his eyes were open. But he was gone. Whatever made Jonathan Holt the specific continuous person he had been for 62 years had simply vacated the premises, leaving only the mechanism running. He sat in that chair for 11 days before everything finally stopped altogether. His eyes wide, with an expression of vacant terror, remained. People said it was the witches, of course. Everything was the witches now, including the early frost that had damaged the corn, and the milk that had soured, and the argument between the Putnams and the nurses that everyone had been waiting to explode for a decade. But they said it with a slightly different quality of fear than usual, because Magistrate Holt had signed 17 death warrants, and there was a small and shameful thought moving through Salem like water under ice. He had it coming. Nobody said this out loud, even thinking it felt dangerous. Mercy sat with the knowledge of what she had seen in the woods and did not know what to do with it. She considered telling her father, but her father was a frightened man in a frightened town, and frightened people needed somewhere to put their fear. And she had no desire to become that somewhere. She considered telling Reverend Parris, and then almost immediately did not consider this anymore. She went back to the woods instead. She told herself she was going to gather evidence. She told herself she was going to find out what they were doing and stop it. She told herself many things that she half believed, and under all of them, underneath the rational architecture she was building to justify what she was doing, was the simple truth. She needed to understand. Goody Marsh was waiting for her at the edge of the clearing. "I wondered when you'd come back," the old woman said. She did not seem threatening. She seemed like herself, the midwife, the woman who had pressed her warm hands to Mercy's mother's forehead when the fever was worst, who had sat with the dying through all the long nights the town needed sitting with. "Come and sit." "What did you do to Magistrate Holt?" Mercy said. "She stayed at the tree line." Goody Marsh considered this. "We returned to him what he gave out. Nothing more and nothing less. He sat in a room and passed judgment on people he did not know and signed papers that ended their lives. We gave him a room." She looked at Mercy, his own mind, forever, until it gave out. "That's murder." "Is it?" This was not a question. "And Martha Corey, she's dead. She was hanged. How is she?" "In some traditions," Goody Marsh said, "there are agreements that can be made. Martha made hers 20 years ago. The hanging was unpleasant, but not permanent." She tilted her head. "You saw it with your own eyes. You're already past the point of deciding whether it's possible. Now, you're just deciding what it means." Mercy looked at her for a long time. "What are you going to do next?" The old woman's face, in the moonlight, was calm and absolute. "What they deserve," she said simply. "Innocent people are dying," Mercy said. "Stop the trials. Stop the accusations. If you have power, use it to—" "We are using it." Something moved behind Goody Marsh's eyes. Not cruelty exactly, but a patience so deep it had become indistinguishable from certainty. "We have been using it carefully for weeks, and carefully takes time. But we are not without feeling, child. We know what innocent means. We have been watching them take it from people for a long time." "Then help them. Save them instead of—" "We tried." For the first time, something cracked in the old woman's voice. "Rebecca Nurse. We tried for Rebecca Nurse. We put every working we had toward that woman, and she hanged anyway, because Salem wanted her to hang, and there are things even we cannot do against the full weight of what a town wants. She paused. So now we have adjusted our approach. Mercy went home. She went home and she sat at her table. And she made a list in her head, because writing it down was insane, of everyone she knew was innocent, everyone she had watched accused and convicted and executed by a process that had the form of justice and none of the substance. The list was long. The list was so long it made her chest ache. She made another list in the same internal space of the people who had driven it, the accusers, the magistrates, the people who had shown up to point fingers and collect land afterward. Because there was always land involved, she had noticed that the way accusations had a tendency to fall on people who owned something someone else wanted. The two lists did not overlap. She went back to the clearing. The second thing happened to Reverend Parris's house. It began with sounds in the walls, not rats, the carpenter swore, because he pulled up the floorboards and found nothing. Sounds like voices, low and layered, speaking a language nobody recognized. The sounds started at midnight and continued until 3, every night for a week. Then, the voices moved inside. They did not speak to Paris directly. They spoke to each other in the language that wasn't any language, and the sound of them occupied his skull at all hours, waking and sleeping, and he began to look the way men look when they have not slept properly in some time. Hollowed, translucent, wild-eyed at the edges. His sermons took on a quality that made his congregation increasingly uncomfortable. He spoke of things he claimed to see, shapes at the corners of rooms, hands reaching up through the floorboards. He wrote letters to Cotton Mather that Mather did not respond to. His daughter Betty, the same Betty whose fits had started the whole cascade in February, sat down beside her father one Sunday evening and took his hand and said, with the clarity of a child who has decided that honesty is the only remaining option, "Father, they are very angry." "Who?" Paris whispered. Betty looked at the middle distance in a way that made her father's skin crawl. "All of them," she said. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Paris understood perfectly well who all of them meant, and the understanding settled into him, like cold water rising, and did not leave. He began sleeping in the church. The voices followed him there. Mercy had started meeting with the Coven twice a week. She told herself each time that she was gathering information. She told herself she was a spy, an investigator, a rational young woman trying to understand an irrational situation in order to stop it. This fiction lasted approximately 3 weeks, at which point Goody Marsh handed her a small pouch of herbs and salt and said, "Hold this." And something moved through Mercy's hands that she had no name for in English or any other language she knew. A warmth that started in her palms and moved up her arms and settled in the center of her chest like an ember, and she stood in the clearing holding a pouch of herbs and understood that the fiction was over. "What was that?" she said. "Recognition," Martha Corey said from across the fire. "It feels like that the first time." "I'm not a witch," Mercy said. Nobody in the clearing said anything, which was its own answer. She thought about her mother who had known the name of every plant in the forest, who had kept a garden that produced things out of season, whose hands on a fever patient were uncannily effective in ways the physician who came after her could never quite replicate. Her mother, who had died of a fever herself at 31, which had always struck Mercy as strange. A woman who could break other people's fevers, defeated by her own. "Did you know my mother?" she asked Goody Marsh. The old woman's expression softened into something complicated. Eleanor Calloway was one of the finest women I have known in this life. She chose to leave when she did. That was her right. Mercy sat with this information. She chose. There are agreements, Marsh said again, that can be made in both directions. Mercy nodded slowly. Something that had been loose in her chest for 8 years clicked quietly into place. She kept coming to the clearing. The third thing was the harvest. The corn that had survived the early frost failed in October. All of it, all at once, in a single night, as though something had moved through the fields and made a decision. It was not blight. The physicians and the farmers examined the stalks and could find no disease. The corn was simply dead, standing upright, dry and grey and done, as if it had decided to stop. The winter wheat went the same way a week later. Salem began to be hungry. The hunger was a specific, careful hunger. It touched every household that had a member who had signed a death warrant, testified against a neighbor, filed an accusation. The adjacent households, those whose heads had kept their mouths shut and their hands in their pockets through the whole bloody spring and summer, found their root cellars mysteriously full, found their milk sweet and their dried meat uncorrupted and their bread rising well. People noticed this. Of course they noticed, and people being people, they constructed an explanation that preserved their existing worldview. The witches were punishing the godly and rewarding the wicked. This explanation was backward, but Salem could not see that from inside it. The accusations increased. 3 more people were arrested in October, all of them, and this was now so blatant that even Magistrate Sewall noticed, though he recorded his noticing as a concern rather than an action, from households that had no connection to any previous accusation, households whose main distinguishing feature was that they had thus far been untouched by the winter's famine. Mercy watched this happen and felt something new move through her. She had been afraid for months. Fear had become the water she swam in. But this was different. This was a cold, specific rage that had edges and weight, and she held it carefully because it felt like the kind of rage that could crack her open if she wasn't precise. She went to the clearing, and she said to Goody Marsh, "The hunger is causing more accusations. You're making it worse." "We know," Marsh said. "Then stop it. The hunger is teaching them what they have done," Martha Corey said. She was sitting at the edge of the fire, and her face was not unkind, but it was absolute. "Salem built this. We are helping them understand the architecture of it. You cannot understand what you've built without feeling its weight." "More innocents will hang," Mercy said. "Yes," Corey said, "and that blood will be on Salem, not on us. We do not control who they choose to accuse. We gave them hunger. They turned it into another instrument of murder. That is a fact about them, not about us. It's also a foreseeable consequence that you could have prevented." Corey looked at her for a long time. "You sound like someone who hasn't watched enough of them hang yet," she said. "Keep watching. Give yourself another month. Then come tell me again about foreseeable consequences." It was a brutal thing to say. It was also not wrong, and Mercy hated it, and she went home and kept watching. She was accused in November. She had known it was coming. She had felt it building the way you feel weather building. A change in the pressure of every interaction. The slight adjustment in how people met her eyes. The way her father had started watching her with an expression she couldn't pass. She didn't know who filed the complaint. She suspected Ann Putnam the younger, who had watched Mercy fail to applaud enthusiastically enough at one of the hangings, and had the kind of memory for social infractions that functions as a weapon in the hands of a frightened person. The constable came on a Tuesday morning. Her father was in his shop. He came to the door when he heard voices in the house, and he stood in the doorway between the shop and the kitchen and watched them put Mercy's wrists in irons, and he said nothing. His face did not say nothing. His face said everything he did not have the courage to say out loud, but he stood there in the doorway and was very quiet and very still, and the constable took Mercy out the door, and her father did not move. She understood, walking through Salem in irons in the November cold, that this was the end of one story, and she was not yet sure what story came next. She did not look for Thomas Arden in the stocks. She kept her eyes forward. The jail was cold and full and smelled of people who had been afraid for a long time in an enclosed space. She was put in a cell with two women she didn't know, a farmer's wife from Andover and a girl younger than herself who had been there since August and had gone somewhere inside herself that she was not coming back from. Mercy sat down on the floor and leaned against the stone wall and thought about her options. She had, she concluded, very few. She thought about her mother, who had chosen, apparently, to make an agreement in the other direction. She thought about Thomas Arden's eyes. She thought about the blue-edged fire in the clearing and the warmth that had moved up her arms from a pouch of herbs and salt, and the way it had felt like being recognized by something that had been waiting patiently for a long time. She thought about her father standing silent in the doorway. She thought about Martha Corey, who had been hanged and was now sitting at the edge of a fire in the woods with her face fierce and alive and completely, beautifully uncompromised. She made a decision. She was not sure later whether the decision summoned what happened next or whether what happened next was always going to happen, and the decision was simply her arriving, finally, at the thing she had been walking toward since August. The distinction seemed less important than it had before. Goody Marsh came to the jail. Not in person. In person, Goody Marsh was presumably somewhere the town could not find her, because the town would very much have liked to find her. She came the way she came in the clearing, in the register of experience that Mercy had been slowly, reluctantly learning to access over the past 3 months, a warmth, a presence, the particular quality of attention that the old midwife had always carried, the sense of being seen completely and not found wanting. She said one thing. She said it in the part of Mercy that was not ears. "When you're ready." Mercy closed her eyes. She thought about it properly, about what it meant, about what she was choosing, and what she was giving up, though the second list had been growing shorter for months, and the process of creating it felt increasingly like counting things she had already lost. Her father's face in the doorway, a normal life in a normal town, the ordinary safety of being unremarkable. She thought about the warmth in her hands. She thought about her mother. Ready. The lock opened. She did not open it. She was sitting against the opposite wall when it opened. The jailkeeper was asleep at his desk, in the way men are asleep when sleep has been strongly encouraged by outside forces. The corridor was empty. The outer door was open. Mercy Calloway walked out of Salem jail into the November dark, and she walked east toward the tree line, and she did not look back. She looked back once. The lights of Salem behind her, the candles in windows, the torch above the jail door, the distant glow that meant the church was lit for an evening meeting, looked small and very fragile, the way a fire looks when you're standing far enough away that you can hold your hand up and block it entirely. The town looked like something a child had built, and she felt something looking at it that was too complex to be a single feeling. Grief and fury and something that was almost pity, except that pity requires a kind of distance she was no longer sure she had. She turned back to the trees. The clearing was full when she arrived. All 7 women, and now 8, and she understood, standing at the tree line, that she was the 8th. The fire was higher than she had seen it, and the color had shifted. The blue edges gone, now burning entirely in shades of deep purple and green that her eyes said were impossible, and her eyes were wrong. Goody Marsh held out her hands. Mercy walked forward. The ritual took until dawn. She would not be able to describe it afterward, not because she couldn't remember, but because it existed in a register that description could not reach, like trying to describe silence using only loud things. What she could say was that it hurt, and then it did not hurt, and then it felt like the ember in her chest that had been sitting there since August, bloomed open into something much larger, something that took up all the space she had available and then made more space, and she understood that she had been walking around for 17 years, in a house with all the windows shuttered, and someone had just opened every window at once. She understood other things too, the shape of what was coming, the Coven's final working, which they had been building since February with the patience of people who understood that the things worth doing take time. She understood why Martha Corey was smiling. The end came on a night in December, 6 weeks after Mercy walked out of Salem jail. The town had been searching for her. Of course it had. An escaped accused witch was exactly the kind of story that Salem in 1692 ran on, and her escape had been impossible enough. The lock simply open, the keeper simply asleep, that it had been added to the growing catalogue of supernatural events that people repeated to each other in the breathless, addicted way that frightened communities repeat their own nightmares. She had become, in her absence, larger than she had ever been in her presence. Salem had decided she was powerful, dangerous, and at the center of everything, which was, she reflected, deeply ironic given how invisible she had spent most of her life trying to be. The night it happened was clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that makes the stars look close enough to touch, the kind that makes fire look like the only real thing. The fire started in the Paris house. Not an accident. The December drought had made everything dry, but this fire started in 6 places simultaneously, and each place burned with the same purple-green that Mercy had seen in the clearing. And the flame did not spread the way ordinary fire spreads, outward and indiscriminate. It moved with intention. It moved through Salem like something that knew exactly where it was going, and where it was going was every house in which a death warrant had been signed, every house from which an accusation had been filed, every household where someone had stood in a crowd and pointed a finger and chosen to be certain. The unaffiliated houses, and there were some, more than Salem's reputation allowed, people who had kept their mouths shut and their hands in their pockets and their names off documents, did not burn. The fire knew, the fire was specific. People ran. People always run from fire. They ran into the December streets, and some of them tried to form bucket chains from the well, which was frozen, and some of them stood and watched with the dazed, detached quality of people who have been waiting for something without knowing what they were waiting for, and now know. Mercy stood at the edge of the tree line and watched Salem burn, and felt things she could not have felt 6 months ago, because 6 months ago she did not have the room. She felt the weight of every name on every death warrant. She felt the particular cold of the jail cell, and Thomas Arden's eyes in the stocks, and the sound of a crowd that wanted certainty more than it wanted truth. She felt the specific, irreplaceable wrongness of Rebecca Nurse hanged, of Martha Corey hanged, of the 20 who had died, and the hundreds who had been touched, and the thousands of ways a town can be complicit without ever once getting its own hands visibly dirty. She felt her father standing in the doorway. She held all of it, and she let it be exactly what it was, and she watched the fire that she had helped build do what it had been built to do. A figure appeared at the edge of the firelight, coming toward the tree line, stumbling, coughing. She recognized him before his face was clear. Her father, Thomas Calloway, running from the tailor shop on the wrong street, or the right street, depending on how you calculated these things. The shop had not burned. He had run toward the woods, toward the tree line, toward his daughter, who he had watched leave in irons and had said nothing. He stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other across a distance of perhaps 20 feet and several unbridgeable things. His face was doing what it had done in the doorway, showing everything he could not say. Behind him, the town he had lived in for 40 years was burning in colors that had no natural explanation, and he was looking at his daughter, who was standing at the tree line with her hands still and her face lit by impossible firelight, and he was understanding, in the specific and total way that fear strips things down to, exactly what she was. Mercy waited to see what he would do with it. He took a step forward, then another. He stopped 6 feet from her, and the firelight moved on his face, and he said, "Mercy." Just her name, nothing else. The word containing, like a very small vessel holding a very large thing, everything he should have said and hadn't and couldn't, and perhaps, even now, would not. She studied him for a long moment. She thought about the space the ember in her chest had opened up, all that room she hadn't had before. She thought about what to do with the room. "Go north," she said. "There's a family in Ipswich that will take you in. Goodman Fletcher. Tell him Goody Marsh sent you. He'll ask no questions." Her father's mouth worked. "You should come." "No," she said, simply. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she let him look. And then he turned north and walked, and she watched him go until the dark took him. She turned back to the trees. The Coven was behind her, waiting. Goody Marsh, Martha Corey, alive beyond all reason, Ruth Heller with her eyes up, Anne Price with her hands loose at her sides, the others, whose names she was still learning. Ahead of her, Salem burned its specific and chosen burning. She took one breath of cold December air, tasting smoke and pine, and the salt that came off the sea even this far inland, and she felt the ember in her chest and the room around it, and the particular quality of standing at the edge of everything you were, and choosing. Then she walked into the trees. Behind her, the last roof fell. The fire burned until nothing was left that deserved to burn, and then, specifically, impossibly, entirely, it stopped. What remained of Salem stood in the cold silence of a December morning, smoke rising patient and grey into a sky the color of pewter, and the stars that had been visible before the fire were visible again, now that the fire had finished, impossibly bright, impossibly close, the way they always are when everything else has finally gone dark. Somewhere in the remaining houses, a child cried. Somewhere in the forest, 8 women walked deeper into the trees. The sound of their footsteps faded. Then there was only the cold, and the smoke, and the specific silence, that follows the things that cannot be taken back.